Did you feel bad at all letting Leo DiCaprio drown?
Bruce, I gotta interrupt you for a second. That sounds really fascinating, but we have breaking news. Apple Podcasts just announced a brand new feature that you will want to know about. Apple has just created podcast channels. What is a podcast channel, you might say? We're gonna talk about that in this video and also give you some things that you need to know before you create one.
Here we go!
The new Apple Podcast Channels feature allows you to group multiple shows in one place. So imagine if you have a main podcast that you focus on most of the time, but you have some side projects that you like to throw time to every once in a while just for fun. You can now group all of those shows into your podcast channel, and then that becomes a thing that you share with potential listeners to let them know about everything that you're doing. Or let's say that you're managing a podcast network, even if it's an unofficial one where it's just friends getting together and promoting each other. You can create, potentially, a channel on Apple with all of those shows listed. There are some caveats to making that happen, which we're gonna talk about later in this video, but you could potentially do that. So big picture, channels allow you to create a more customized experience for your audience when they discover your content in Apple Podcasts. So you can create custom icons for your channel. You can add links to a specific website that you want people to go to, whether it's your personal website or a website to learn more or to buy your products or whatever it is. And you can also create custom cover art that will show up at the top of somebody's screen when they're looking on Apple Podcasts or on their laptop or on their TV. And so it's a much better experience from a listener perspective and gives you an opportunity to share everything that you're doing with people that would be interested in what you're up to. So we think podcast channels can be a really great tool for podcasters that have multiple shows. But there are some things that you should be aware of before you create your very first podcast channel.
3, 2, 1. Here we go!
So here are some details that we think are pretty important to know going into creating your first podcast channel so they don't catch you by surprise and so you can take full advantage of this feature and what it's capable of. The first one being you can only attach a podcast to one channel at a time. So Apple doesn't want you just creating like personal playlists of things you like to listen to. That's not really how channels are designed to work. Instead, what they want you to do is group your shows together in a place that people can find them and listen to them and follow them individually. So if you create a podcast for the shows that you're currently working on, and then you have like a second podcast for like another thing that you're doing, and you want it to be in a different channel, it can't be in both channels at once. So big picture, every podcast can only be associated with one channel at a time. The other thing to know is you can have completely free podcast channels. So if all of your podcasts that are currently listed in Apple Podcasts are freely available, you can put them into a channel. But if you want to take advantage of Apple's freemium or paid subscription features, which we just talked about recently here on the channel, we'll link it up in the cards and in the description below if you want to see the new monetization feature Apple just rolled out. If you add one or more paid podcasts to your channel, the entire channel becomes paid. And so even if you have free content inside of that channel, if there's any paid content at all, the entire channel has to get unlocked with a subscription. So just keep that in mind. If you want the channel to stay free, then put your premium content or your paid content into a different channel. Now, one thing that caught us by surprise is that you can't actually subscribe or follow a channel. Apple wants you to follow or subscribe to individual shows that happen to be listed inside of a channel. And we asked them that directly because in our minds, that didn't really make a lot of sense. If you want to listen to all these shows that are in this channel, why don't you just press one button and now you have everything? And what they pointed out was that a lot of channels that are starting to be created don't just have like 3 or 4 podcasts in there. Some of them have upwards of 100 podcasts in a single channel. And so what they wanted to avoid was following a channel and then all of a sudden your entire library is just filled up with shows that you aren't necessarily interested in listening to. You just wanted like 1 or 2 shows from inside of that channel. So podcast channels are not something that people will necessarily be able to follow, but they're still really great because it's one place you can send everyone to and they can see everything that you're doing. So it's still a great feature. Just recognize and understand that you're not going to be giving calls to action to have your listeners follow your podcast channel. You'll still want them to follow or subscribe to particular podcasts in order to get it in their library. And the last thing that you need to be aware of when it comes to creating your podcast channel is that you can only add podcasts that are listed under the same Apple ID. So this is where if you're managing a podcast network and you want to create a channel for that network, things can kind of get tricky. Because if you want your podcast and your friend's podcast and this other podcast over here to all be in one channel, you have to migrate them to be under the same Apple ID in order for that feature to be unlocked in that way. Now, if you've submitted like 4 shows under your personal Apple ID, all 4 of those shows are gonna show up as you being able to add them to your channel. And so if you look at the channel that we created for Buzzsprout, you can see all 4 of our shows are listed in the channel because we submitted them all through the same Apple ID. Now, there is a process you can go through to shift the Apple ID that's associated with those podcasts. And Apple does give you the option of adding users and administrators within Podcast Connect. So even if people do migrate their shows to a new Apple ID, they can still access all their analytics and things like that. And we'll leave a link to some instructions that you can go through to do that. But just know that this is really set up for podcast networks and independent creators that have full control and ownership of their podcast content. If you want to use this channel feature for a podcast network that has multiple creators that all own various elements of their podcasts, that'll just be something that you'll need to do in order to unlock the channel for your network.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
So we think Apple's new podcast channels can be a really great tool to allow podcasters that have multiple shows or even potentially podcast networks to get the word out there about all the great content they're creating. And in the near future, we're actually gonna create a step-by-step tutorial showing you how to create a podcast channel inside of Apple Podcasts. So if you wanna watch that when it comes out, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you wanna see everything that Apple just announced, we just did a deep dive into all the announcements by posting a video here on the channel. We'll link that in the description, and you can just click the video that just popped up right here on the screen if you wanna watch that to hear more about the new subscriptions feature, to hear about the new Smart Play button, and all the things that we think Apple is doing that is really gonna help set podcasting in a positive trajectory. Well, we hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, keep podcasting.